I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to the U.S. clandestine operations against China during the early Cold War conference today. That's a mouthful, but it's certainly something that is interesting and relevant. And that's exactly what history should be. This is a conference that is hosted by the International History Institute under the leadership of my fine colleague John Woodward from the Pardee School. When we think about history and the question of clandestine operations, it's really everywhere. And I'm reminded of the meeting that took place in Anchorage, Alaska in March of 2021 between the most senior American and Chinese diplomats. And at that meeting, my former boss, Antony Blinken, said to the Chinese, "We're concerned about your cyber attacks on the United States." I want to read you the response that came from a Chinese director of Central Commission of Foreign Affairs, Yang Jieqi. He said, and I quote, "On cyber attacks, let me say that whether it's the ability to launch cyber attacks or the technologies that could be deployed, the United States is the champion in this regard. You can't blame this problem on somebody else." So there you go. It's right up front. And if you missed that, which you may have, you didn't miss the spy balloon. Last February, something that was largely identified as an unidentified flying object floated across the United States, creating consternation, threats, and indeed concerns about an extraterrestrial invasion. People were angry. And when we look at the state of relations between the United States and China today, we have to wonder, as we consider today the early Cold War, are we in Cold War 2.0? I guess you're supposed to say 2.0, is that correct? Why they mixed that, I don't know. These are the questions we're facing. Our presenters today are going to examine some of the early history of clandestine operations by the United States against China. And in all cases, in examining history, we do it because it's inherently interesting, but we also do it because we want to learn from the past and maybe avoid making the mistakes that might have been made in the past. Today, though, we're also going to be focusing on something that I think is sadly underrated and maybe not sufficiently present in our public life today, and that's courage. The Romans used to say that courage is not the most important virtue. It's not the only virtue, but it's the most important because without it, no other virtues would be possible. And we're going to hear today of the history of two Americans, Richard Fecteau and Jack Downey, each of whom spent over 19 years in captivity in China and emerged to talk about it. We have a terrific group of folks who will be speaking with you today. Professor June Grasso from BU's College of General Studies, Professor Tom Christensen of Columbia University. Unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond their control, they're going to have to come to us remotely. Dr. Nicholas, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Dujmovic, is that correct? Retired CIA chief historian or assistant chief historian? Where is he? Deputy chief historian, with whom I just had a lovely chat. And Jack Parker, who must be a legendary coach, having been coach of the BU hockey team for nearly 40 years. How could that possibly take place? And finally, everything's going to be wound up by my colleague John Woodward from the Pardee School. You've already seen, as things have gone by, that this is going to be recorded for audio, and it also is going to be online, so please be aware of that. Please also be aware that we have with us an eminent journalist, Jane Perlez. Where is Jane? I just saw her. There she is, over there. Jane and I apparently took a flight together to North Korea about 23 years ago. And finally, I want to let you all know that this conference is taking place, as all conferences do, with support of many, including the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, the BU Center for the Study of Asia, the Kilachand Honors College, And you will see support from students from Delta Phi Epsilon, the BU International Relations fraternity here as well. Robert Gold and Joseph Burke, Questrom 83, have also provided support. So with all that, I want to also mention the presence of several faculty members from the Pardee School. I see Joe Whipple and Andre Mamiola, and Grant Rode was here. Where is he? And there's Tom is here. Who else? Anyway, so I'm glad to see the faculty well represented. With that, I'd like to turn it over to one of our students, Camilla Kelly, who will introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Storella, for that introduction. I will be introducing our first speaker today, Professor June Grasso. June Grasso is an associate professor of social sciences at Boston University's College of General Studies. She has a PhD in modern Chinese history from Tufts University, and among her publications are Truman's Two-China Policy, Japan's New Deal for China, Japan's New Deal for China, propaganda aimed at Americans before Pearl Harbor, and modernization and revolution in China. She has also published several articles on U.S.-China relations. So thank you for your attention, and please give a warm welcome to Professor June Grasso.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And as I continue to try to maneuver this technology here, I'm trying to get to there we go. I just want to say that it is an honor for me to be as part of this program. And what I would like to do, which I think is going to be probably the least exciting of all the presentations you're going to hear, is to go through an overview of the beginning of the Cold War, and then especially focusing on Asia. And then talk about the intensification and then the temporary waning of Cold War with respect to the relationships between the United States and China, and even to an extent between the United States and the Soviet Union. What we see here in this photo is from 1945. And this took place, of course, during the waning months of World War II, when the Cold War was really beginning to see, at least from hindsight, its head rearing as a result of disagreements among the leaders of the Allied powers during World War II. With there, of course, you probably can identify right away some of these illustrious leaders: Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and so what we see in this particular picture looks to be an auspicious occasion when agreements were made. But we now know, as historians, that the disagreements about the way the war was fought and the way in which it was going to turn out would not be necessarily in American interests. Now, our focus is going to be, okay, let's see, there we go. Our focus is going to be primarily on a few presidents today. And one of the major presidents, one of the most important presidents in dealing with the intensification of the Cold War was Harry Truman. The map you see is of what Europe looked like in the early years of the Cold War, when after World War II, it was split into two sides, influenced by, in blue, you see the US, and influenced by the Soviet Red Army. And Roosevelt, of course, had died in April of 1945. And when Truman, obviously his vice president, comes to power prematurely, it begins to set the stage for conflicts with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. And so within a few months, because of crises that were happening primarily in Europe, such as in Poland and in other parts of Eastern Europe like Greece and Turkey, Truman, in a sense, puts his foot down and creates a policy that he announces is the containment of the spread of Soviet-influenced communism from that point on in 1947. That policy of containment was controversial, needless to say, because it had to be backed up, and it was going to be difficult to do so. Now, of course, our study today is going to be focused primarily on Asia. And for Truman, Asia was going to be a huge problem. And so a little bit of background about that really is warranted at this particular point. What we see here in these two maps, which I know probably are a little bit difficult to discern, are two maps of China at the beginning of World War II, at least the year that the United States entered the war, on the left, and then nearer to the end of the war. And of course, among the big five leaders, that who were a part of World War II, you had the leadership of the Republic of China, who I'll introduce to you in a minute. But as you can see from these maps, that even before World War II would end in Asia, the United States is going to face a series of difficulties with China. What I mean by that is that you see on the left, obviously China being colored in blue, with the territories that the Japanese occupied right around the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. You also see the government of China, the Republic of China, claiming that it controls those territories in light green. And then the rival organization at that particular time to the Republic of China, a relatively small Chinese Communist Party that has some control over parts of northern China that are in those pink areas to the center. Whereas in the map on the right, you notice that as the Japanese were on the verge of being defeated, in the lighter pink colors, the Chinese communists have begun to expand their territory and had expanded their territory significantly during the war, primarily because they had been fighting effectively against the Japanese. Now, our allies during World War II in China were the leadership of the Republic of China. And here we have the head of China, the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and his glamorous wife, Mei Ling-sung, or Madame Zhang. As a couple, they engaged in creating an atmosphere that really allowed them to be befriended by many American politicians and supporters of their goals. I mentioned this time in their history, in the history of China, as the nationalist decade, meaning the decade during which their party, the Nationalist Party, was most prominent, because it was then when Generalissimo Zhang actually had a makeover of sorts, and divorced his first Chinese wife, married an Americanized Chinese, Mei Ling-sung, who spoke beautiful English, who was educated here, not only in the States, but at Wellesley College, and had close ties through her family business associates in Europe and in the US. And so the combination of this new power couple in China made them irresistible, especially to many members of Congress who felt that China was for the foreseeable future a stalwart ally, of the United States. This would continue well, as you'll see, into the years of World War II and into the Civil War, which we'll talk about, when Mei Sung visits at this point the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, during World War II, there were also some troubling signs that the military was trying to discern. The main goal of the U.S. alliance with China during the war was to utilize the Chinese assistance in defeating Japan. The United States was the country that was the primary fighter in the Asia War, besides China, because the others of our allies were engaged primarily in Europe. And so what we see here is one of many opportunities that the United States military, Congress, and others went to observe what was actually going on in China that was effective or not effective in the Chinese fight against our enemy in Asia, the Japanese. And so we see here General John Davies with the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong. The Chinese communists were lauded in many ways for having a more effective program against the Japanese. Did that translate into actual support, for financial support, for example, from the United States Congress to the communists? The answer is no. But there were those who thought that that may have been, a potentially better way to use American money. Now, of course, that eventually, with the victory of the United States and its allies over both the Germans and the Japanese, the issue for peace in the world was going to be in the hands of the allies who prevailed. But the conditions for President Truman in Asia were highly unstable, and the war was over in August 1945. And at that time, Truman understood that there could be, sooner rather than later, conflict between the two contenders, so to speak, in China, the Nationalist Party, under the leadership of the American ally, Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese communists. And so as a result, what Truman did was to send one of his most trusted generals, General George Marshall, who would eventually become Secretary of State, to conduct a mission to China and to try to create a kind of coalition government. In other words, attempting in a way to get the communists and the nationalists together so that civil war could be averted. Truman worried about the results of the Civil War and whether this would be of real danger to security in the Pacific, if not globally. What we see in this particular photograph is a dinner held during what was the so-called the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists so that they could come to an agreement with what was hoped to be a nationalist government with communist participation. However, the bottom line is that soon after Marshall left, civil war began, and within 3 years, the Chinese communists came to power. Now, the situation for the Truman administration with the victory of Mao on October 1st, 1949, was highly problematic. Truman had faced during those years, during those post-war years, considerable domestic criticism from his detractors in the Republican Party and others for what was seen as a weak foreign policy, um, because was rather relatively volatile. After uh, the war had been completed, including some of the crises he dealt with more or less effectively, such as the Berlin crisis or problems in other areas of Eastern Europe. But the situation in China was one that was even more highly problematic. And one of the reasons for that was that it had spiraled out of the control of the United States in terms of determining the future government of China. And in September 1949, for example, the State Department issued a white paper, a policy paper, which was relatively lengthy, and explained the history of U.S. relations with China. Uh, and but its most controversial part was its introduction, in which the State Department asserted that the whatever happens in China in the near future is not something that can be controlled by the United States government. And then within 4 weeks, Mao's victory was clear, and Mao announced the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Right away, the issue of diplomatic recognition was considered by the Truman administration, primarily because Truman was not totally clear at that point that Mao was essentially a puppet of Stalin, or that he would be in the future. Truman understood that there was potential for maybe weaning the Chinese communists away from the bigger Soviet bloc. However, as time went on, Truman's so-called wait and see policy did not pay off well for him. First of all, Mao chose to visit Moscow in December 49, coming back in early 1950 with a new treaty of friendship and alliance signed with Stalin, which seemed to Truman as a betrayal. And then in addition, our closest allies, the British, recognized and had diplomatic ties with the Chinese communists in January 1950 because of their concern about the future of Hong Kong. And so you had in 1950, as a result, the State Department and the National Security Council having to get together and reassess U.S. policy and think about whether the containment policy, which had dealt primarily with Europe, should be a global policy. Now, the biggest problem for the United States, at least initially, appeared to be what to do about our allies. Should essentially they be ignored? And this shows, of course, that the map, that is still very much like a map you could use today, that the government of Chiang Kai-shek and Mei Ling-sung had already taken off for Taiwan. And in fact, as early as 1948, Chiang had begun to divert shipments of supplies to Taiwan, where they set up the Republic of China, using the same name, obviously as the country as it had been on the mainland. Now, things only get worse as the months wore on, and other post-war situations became problematic for the United States. One of those situations had to do with the peninsula, the Korean peninsula in Asia. And all we see here in this particular slide are the two leaders who would emerge in the months after the defeat of Japan as leaders of a divided Korea. The propaganda poster that you see on your left is one of Kim Il Sung. He sort of looks like his great great grandson today, who had taken over. Kim was a communist, needless to say, and he had fought valiantly against the Japanese as part of the Chinese communist groups in North China. And then there was the leader from South Korea, sponsored by the U.S. And this deserves a little bit of attention as a topic, not only because the Korean War will intensify the Cold War in Asia in a way that hadn't been seen before, but also because it would be a huge problem for the Truman administration to deal with in terms of his domestic policy and the criticism he would receive, by his detractors in Congress and in the press. The Korea had originally been divided as part of a deal made back at that Yalta conference that we saw this slide from at the very beginning. And the whole purpose of dividing Korea, which, by the way, had been a Japanese colony since the early 20th century, was to allow for both the presence of American and Soviet troops to repatriate Japanese back home and give the Korean people, at least in theory, the freedom to choose their future. That's how it was discussed back in 45 at Yalta. And so that was the agreement that was made, and that was how the agreement played out. Initially, in 1948, by 1948, Soviet troops had been removed from the northern part of the Korea after they had completed their job, and North Korea was, in theory, considered a trustee of the Soviet Union for that brief amount of time, and then in the South, American troops also would leave. However, in the meantime, what had happened is that those two leaders who were betrayed emerged as those who were supported by their respective sides. So Syngman Rhee from South Korea was supported by the Americans, and Kim Il Sung by the Soviets. And neither man in charge of their separate country wanted to tolerate the notion that Korea should be divided. It had been a unified country, even as a colony of Japan, you could argue, for several millennia, in its history. So the situation, needless to say, was problematic, and in both sides engaged in skirmishes across the border of the 38th parallel, routinely aggravating and provoking each other as time went on. Now, why this little map that looks so confusing is on the slide is because it is kind of what it is a critique in the American press against Truman's policy. In January 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech to press writers in Washington, D.C., in which he outlined American foreign policy in Asia. And in it, he just listed the places that were of crucial importance to the United States in terms of defense. Those places that the United States would automatically essentially go to war to defend. And some of the obvious ones included Hawaii, Japan, and a few other areas. But what was key and what many Republicans noticed and were upset about was that he failed to mention specifically either Korea or Taiwan. And so the speech became known as a defense perimeter speech. And as you can see from this map, um, it was, it was criticized as being the Atchison line, um, implying that the United States would not go to a war in order to help these countries that many of Truman's critics said were crucial for American defense. And so we now know, and one of the things that has found a lot of interest among historians is that in the 1980s, when some of Stalin's papers were released, which is a rare occasion, as you can imagine, in the Soviet Union and Russia, Stalin admitted that he also interpreted the defense perimeter speech very much like some Republican critics of Truman, and that is that the U.S. would not go to war to support South Korea. And so after Kim Il-sung had asked both Stalin and Mao for support several times, that support was coming, and North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950. The UN Security Council declared war on North Korea. And so the US troops, who made up the bulk of the troops fighting in the Korean War, among, of course, there were other allies too, fought under the UN flag. The way in which that could happen, that is, the declaration of war could happen, was that the Soviets were boycotting those meetings over, ironically, the issue of representation in the UN by China. In other words, the Soviets wanted the communist government in Beijing to represent China, but that had not yet happened. And so what we see there is the implementation or the reinterpretation of a document saying that containment was going to be global. And that's what NSC 68 asked for, and now it was implemented in the Korean War. Now, the Korean War was an event that would lead to even more tension with China. And these four little maps show you the progress. We don't have to go into great detail about that. But the bottom line is that after the success of the Incheon landing by General Douglas MacArthur, who you see there with Harry Truman, the United States had gained under the UN, the UN flag under the United States troops had gained considerable territory in that blue area in the third map into North Korea. And MacArthur was not shy about using resources to bomb supply lines north of the Yalu River, in some cases dreadfully close to the Soviet city of Vladivostok. And so you see that in October 1950, China entered the war with huge numbers of troops, overwhelming the American presence in the north and pushing the UN troops back to approximately what is now the DMZ or the 38th parallel, causing a war of attrition to be fought, for the next couple of years. Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur, as you probably know, in April 1951, because his goal was to create a limited war and not to engage in a war directly with the Soviet Union or directly with China. And that became highly problematic for his popularity, not so much that he was avoiding war, but that he was considered to be weaker by some of his detractors, and the Cold War just intensified, as a result. The situation didn't get much better with the conclusion of the Korean War in 1953. In 1953, you had a conclusion of the Korean War primarily for two reasons that actually were not so much coincidental as a good opportunity. One was in March of 1953, the death of Joseph Stalin, and the new leadership that came to power in the Soviet Union was more interested than Stalin had been in ending the conflict. And secondly, Dwight Eisenhower, who had become president, he also was instrumental in approaching foreign policy in a more aggressive, or at least verbally aggressive way, rhetorically aggressive way. And so with in the Korean War, it looked as though there could have been a lull in the tensions in Asia, but that's not the way it was going to happen. And in fact, in 1954 and 1958, you have the first of a series of Taiwan Strait crises that will plague the United States. And it is interesting because some of Mao's own writings have been released that deal with this because there have been Taiwan Strait crises since then. But he purposely decided to shell offshore islands that should have been part of the so-called Republic of China as a provocation at a time when the foreign policy situation was tense globally, and there were Cold War issues. You can see from the propaganda poster from China that from the 50s that China was claiming that it was determined to liberate Taiwan. The U.S. 7th Fleet is stationed and had been stationed between Taiwan and the mainland since the days of President Truman, when the Korean War had started. And so it routinely remained a buffer. And yet the Chinese decided to take advantage of crises globally. Now, when I say crises globally, those two dates sort of are the bookends to, crises in Europe, such as the pro-democracy activities that occur as a result of uprisings in Poland and Hungary, and perhaps even more intense, the Suez Crisis that led to war in the Middle East and eventually Egypt's becoming a temporary ally of the Soviet Union. And so all of this together was what Eisenhower had to embrace, and therefore was seen as a much more vigorous and aggressive president against what was happening in Asia. The 1960s did not get much calmer, as I'm sure you're aware. As early as the administration of John F. Kennedy, the United States sent troops to Vietnam. And we see here in this photo, a comrade and chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, with head of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. And the fear of the United States, as expressed by Kennedy in many of his speeches, that there was cooperation among the North Vietnamese, the Chinese, and the Soviets to take over the ally of the United States in South Vietnam. The United States presence in South Vietnam had begun under Eisenhower, and it was a result of the United States not agreeing with our former allies, the French, that Vietnam would be reunited after the French left, after being defeated in 1954. And then, needless to say, the result of that had been a prolonged and protracted struggle against the people of Vietnam and against the fear of the spread of communism, which of course, as you know, communism is still very much in charge of the government in Vietnam. And so for both Kennedy and then of course Lyndon Johnson, who escalated the number of troops, to over 500,000, the tension had become intense. Now we're going to end off with the early 1970s, which is an important part of the discussion of the Cold War, because at least for Asia, Cold War would seem to wane. And the conditions of the early 70s all came together to help bring about this situation. Uh, and and so even though the Vietnam War would not end until early 1973, the conditions that would lead to its ending would be set up, by problems and opportunities that were available those few years earlier. First, the dispute between the two communist superpowers, China and the Soviet Union, had intensified to the point where there was no longer any denial of it. And there was the actual fear on the part of both sides that it could be war. And so this becomes a problematic situation. It's complicated, but it serves as part of the background. The United States, for example, had been able to become somewhat uh, closer in its relationships with the Soviet Union, and under Leonid Brezhnev, actually pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence or détente. And that gave the opportunity to National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to try to open up avenues of diplomacy and communication, not just with the Soviet Union, but even with China. But it was the Chinese who took the first opportunity to make an overture to the United States. And what we see in this photo is a ping pong game in Beijing with the American team. The way this happened and what became known as ping pong diplomacy was the result of a tentative invitation by Premier Zhou Enlai, one of Mao's associates, to the American ping pong or table tennis team that was touring Japan. And when they accepted, of course, they had to go through all kinds of diplomatic channels. This was sort of an open-ended opportunity for Kissinger to try to see what could be done. What did China really want at that time, as its leaders were beginning to age, and its isolation and it was beginning to wear on them, and its relationship with the Soviet Union had been deteriorating, and that was a seat in the United Nations to be rightfully placed there, and the Republic of China or Taiwan kicked out. And that's what they got in 1971 from these negotiations. This iconic photograph that we see here will be one of the many results of the new diplomatic ties between the United States and China. Nixon's monumental and historic trip to China was extremely important in paving the way to the opening up of China. And we see that a lot of what was happening behind the scenes and in the background had to do with the diplomacy that was handled by first National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Of course, he also was maneuvering at the same time, trying to finally get an end to the Vietnam War. So not only did he make his secret trip to China, he also met with Leonid Brezhnev and Andrei Gromyko from the Soviet Union, and began a way to try to play off one side against each other in order to put the most advantage for the United States in this diplomatic situation. We have here the beginning of a new era with the United States and China, with Nixon's visit China. What I'd like to do is to conclude by talking about what made it possible for diplomatic ties to open up with China, but also talking about the situation that was set up in 1972 that is still very much with us today. At this table, you see Kissinger and Nixon, and then across the Premier Zhou Enlai and many interpreters. And this is where they negotiated the Shanghai Communique, which still remains the document that determines how China and the United States today are supposed to relate to each other. The difficulty then and now remains the status of Taiwan. Even though Taiwan is not in the UN and China is, Taiwan is considered to be part of China when it comes to the attitude of Beijing. And so what it says in the Shanghai Communique, which was so important to its being able to be signed, was that there is a sentence which states that Taiwan is part of China. There is also a sentence that states, which of course is what the Americans insisted upon, the Chinese government in Beijing will not use force to take over Taiwan. And that's the way it still stands now. And so it is something that is yet to be resolved. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I can see them in the chat.
Professor Grasso, for giving
Yes.
us a really superb overview. If you have questions, we have our Terrier Courier here who will give you the microphone. And I would ask that you just identify yourself and then ask your question. And Professor Grasso will be able to answer it. We have some time before Professor Christensen will be joining us for our next presentation. So if anyone has any questions, please let us know, and I'll be monitoring the chat to see if we have any questions from our remote audience.
Ask the standard historiographic question that we were faced back in the 40s and 50s. Who lost China? Was it possible for the U.S. to have done anything to have mitigated or avoided that situation? Walter Lippmann, the American columnist, famously wrote criticizing, saying China was never ours to lose in the first place. But I'd like to hear what you have to say.
I agree with that. What could have been done? I don't know. Of course, those who claim that the United States lost China are really talking about domestic issues. That is, a lot of the detractors of the Truman administration were more conservative Republicans who didn't like him or Roosevelt, and so it became much more of a domestic problem as opposed to a foreign issue. I don't think the United States could have done much of anything, and even to one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about, even to say that the Republic of China was ever a democracy was really really a shame, because it misled people. It was never that.
Any other questions from the audience here at Kilachand? Check online. Professor, I'll take the conference convener's privilege and ask you, you mentioned Mao Zedong and you mentioned Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il-jung. And you also pointed out that both the North Korean and the Vietnamese leader had connections to China.
Yes.
Had spent some time there. So to what extent, if any, did Mao or Zhou Enlai have a personal relationship with him? Did they know each other? What did they think of each other? If you could give us some sense from a psychobiography here of
Yeah,
their
that
relationship.
is a good question. Actually, Ho Chi Minh spent a lot of time in the United States, and Zhou Enlai, went to France. And as young people, they would have. It is not clear that they actually knew each other as students abroad, but they got to meet when they all joined forces after. I actually don't know whether they would have met before the end of World War II. Uh, Mao, it's unlikely that Mao met at any time earlier. Um, Ho Chi Minh actually had worked for the OSS for a while, spying on the Japanese. So his connections were much more international than someone like Mao, who was not. So their connections were in the interest of promoting their own views of communism, which was nationalism. Ho Chi Minh did not trust the Chinese, um, just like the leaders of Vietnam today do not trust the Chinese. Uh, and, and so it was probably a very guarded interrelationship.
Questions from our audience here?
Hi, Grant Road, and thank you for that really terrific overview of this period.
Thank you.
My question has to do with whether or not you feel at any time during this early Cold War period, let us say the 50s and the 60s, of whether there was anything that you see that was especially conducive to the subsequent turn of Taiwan to democracy. In other words, some of those personal relationships, perhaps, how the transition of Chiang Kai-shek to his son, how that happened to take place, and such a dramatic transition.
Under Chiang Kai-shek, who lived quite a bit afterwards, there was no hope, I thought. I think that what happened on the island was a way in which the Nationalist Party had to exert its power and pressure to silence the people who were there before. And so I think that family had to go, before Taiwan could become democratic. There was no hope for someone like Chiang Kai-shek. I think that his image changing, which he actually started in the 1920s, was something that was very difficult for him to do.
Questions, or I guess we can indulge comments, criticisms.
Sure. Criticism?
Anyone
Yeah.
cares to share? Same.
And asking silly questions, but de Gaulle thought early in the 1960s that he saw much earlier than we did that there was a Sino-Soviet split and that we should have taken advantage of it. Would you agree with the General?
Yes. I think that the inner circles of the CIA knew earlier. It was something that could not be accepted for the politics of the time in the United States, because it meant that a lot of the Cold War rhetoric had to be revived. Yeah, there were many who saw that. And anybody who knew anything about the relationship between Stalin and Mao and Stalin and the communists when they were, during the 1920s in Southeast China, held up in the mountains, would know that Stalin did not support them anything more than, just rhetoric, and even that was not all that consistent. Very smart.
Anybody have any final questions over here? You will get the last question or the last word in. Please fire away.
Hi, thanks a lot. So, What do you think, like middle powers like Pakistan, Indonesia, or Turkey play in being a bridge between two superpowers?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My I couldn't hear the last part of the question. It was
Okay, let me repeat. So, what
sure.
role do you think like middle powers played in bridging the gap between two superpowers, Soviets and the Americans?
Uh, what is your question that what role did major powers play between bridging the gap between the
Middle
Soviets and the Americans?
middle powers.
Oh, middle powers. Um, that's an interesting question. So you're talking there about uh, the time period, say for example, uh, during the Reagan administration. Is that what you know? So that I think that uh, the gap was really um, something that we saw. I mean, this is my interpretation. That was part of the response to the gap was part of the response to the reforms by Mikhail Gorbachev and what was happening in the Soviet Union itself. Um, you know, I think that in the throughout in the UN there was always push that the Cold War should be less intense for the benefit of peace, but that would have been a hard sell for an administration like Ronald Reagan's. Did that answer your question?
Like I was quite referring to the American reproachment to China, like what role that other countries like American allies play in
Mm.
connecting Americans to Chinese.
Well, one of the important um, impetuses had to do with Japan's role. When Kissinger went to China secretly and did not tell the Japanese government, they were furious. And they immediately began trade ties because Japan's foreign policy in 1970-71 was still tied very much to that of the United States. And they did not want to be kept out of trade with this great market just to their west. And so I think in that sense, yes, you see that other powers were if not instrumental, certainly influential in an indirect way. That's a good question. Thank you.
Professor Grasso, in the interest
Yes.
of time, we have to stop there.
Okay.
Thank you
Great.
very much for joining
Okay.
us.
Thank
Certainly
you.
appreciate the overview
Well,
you've given us. You've
thank
done
you.
an excellent setup for our next speaker, who will
Great.
be introduced by one of the students with Delta Phi Epsilon. And he
Great.
will
Thank
also
you.
be joining us by Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Thomas J. Christensen. Dr. Thomas J. Christensen is a James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations and the Director of the China in the World Program at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Christensen was previously William P. Baswell Professor of World Politics at Princeton University, and from 2006 to 2008, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs with responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. His research and teaching focus on China's foreign relations, the international relations of East Asia, and international security. Dr. Christensen has also taught at Cornell University and MIT, and received his BA from Haverford College, Master's from the University of Pennsylvania, and PhD from Columbia University. He was presented with a Distinguished Public Service Award by the United States Department of State. Thank you for joining us, and please give your full attention to him.
The floor is yours, sir.
Oh, thanks so much, John. I really appreciate your inviting me for this. I'm really happy to be included in a conference in honor of Richard Fecteau, a person I consider a hero and an inspiration of the First Order. And I wanted to recognize Nicholas Dujmovic, who is the real expert on the subjects I'm going to talk about, and who was just so enormously helpful and gracious with his time when I was writing, co-authoring the book about Mr. Downey. He just gave me great advice and corrected some mistakes I was making. John asked me to speak about CIA clandestine operations in the 1950s. I'll talk about those particularly paramilitary activities. And if time permits in the Q&A, it's up to the audience how they want to spend the Q&A time, but I could also talk about the many obstacles in gaining Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau's release. But today I want to focus on what John tasked me to do, which is to talk about the operations themselves. Many of these were run out of the relatively young Office of Political Coordination at CIA. It was only a few years old when Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau launched their own mission. And it was an attempt to create something akin to the Office of Strategic Services in the OSS in the Cold War. The goal was to destabilize and gather intelligence within communist bloc countries, to destabilize those countries and gather intelligence from them. The Korean War starts just a couple of years after the office is created. And the Korean War really mobilizes the United States for the Cold War as we knew it. The US defense budget will triple. It's hard to imagine today, between 1950 and 1951. And the Office of Political Coordination at CIA grows 17-fold from 1949 to 1952. That's really hard to imagine. From 300 officers to 2,200 officers. And the rush to mobilize people to fill these perceived needs led to a lot of people taking posts for which they were not necessarily fully trained. And in some sense, the Office of Political Coordination, OPC, could not be the World War II OSS. And one reason was that, in general, the communist states that were being penetrated were not occupied by foreigners in the way that the states that were occupied by Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan were. In World War II, OSS officers were able to link up with locals who wanted to get foreign forces out of their country and cause costs to those occupying forces. In World War II, the United States was able to exploit first-generation Americans, many of whom spoke the local languages fluently. A relative by marriage in my own family grew up in a Polish-speaking town of Connecticut, first-generation immigrant, joined the OSS to penetrate Europe and link up with Polish-speaking partisans in occupied territories. Unfortunately, from the US perspective related to China in the early Cold War, most Chinese Americans at that time did not speak Mandarin. They were often from the South, spoke Cantonese, etc. And this is one reason why the United States had to rely on KMT interrogators, nationalist interrogators from Taiwan during the Korean War to interview and interrogate captured Chinese soldiers during the war. We also didn't have a large group of people who had spent a lot of time in China. Mr. Downey, about whom I wrote the book, did not know much about Asia before he signed on with the CIA. And I believe Mr. Fecteau did not either. So they relied very heavily on Chinese agents to do the infiltration. And in his memoir, Mr. Downey, quite frankly, says, it talks about his lack of knowledge that he had about China and the very strange feeling that he was directing Chinese people with a lot more knowledge and experience about how to operate within their own country. A second big problem with the operations for the United States is that as Leninists, the communists were very good at social control and surveillance. So they were very difficult to subvert. It's sort of a quality of Leninist regimes. For the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party treats threats to domestic governance as more severe than threats to national security commonly considered by most countries. This is also a function of Leninism, and the CCP spends an inordinate amount of time and resources surveilling and controlling Chinese society. So to this day, it appears that the CCP spends more on domestic security than international security, even though it has a quite substantial defense budget. And it's partially a function of the Chinese language. that there's really no way to separate the term for national security from state security. The term guojia can mean either state or nation, and it appears that Xi Jinping's National Security Commission, which was many people believed a copy of the U.S. National Security Council, is actually more focused on domestic security than it is international security of China. Another problem is that by the time that Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau's operations entered China, the analytics side of the CIA did not see much opportunity to subvert the CCP regime. They thought they had consolidated power and this surveillance mechanism was quite strong. But once the Korean War started, there was another reason to send people into China. And that was to weaken the PRC war effort, or to gain intelligence about the PRC war effort that might serve US and UN forces and ROK forces on the battlefield. And I think that this approach also had a problem. And this is, again, another instance of maybe fighting the last war. World War II was a total war of national survival for the combatants. And the Korean War was a limited war. It was a war of conflict and negotiation by the time that Mr. Fecteau and Mr. Downey's mission was launched. The missions were launched. So as a total war in World War II, anything the OSS could do anywhere around the world to raise costs to the fascist powers would weaken those countries overall in this death struggle that was World War II. By the time Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau entered the Korean War, their operations entered the Korean War. It was a limited war stuck at the 38th parallel, centered on negotiations over the treatment of POWs from both the communist side and the anti-communist side. Raising costs on the margins off the battlefield through subversion would neither shorten that war nor significantly increase the bargaining leverage of the United States and its allies in that war. China would still be able to support North Korea to maintain a stalemate until an armistice that was acceptable was reached by both sides. So the analogies didn't work very well, but it was, I believe, a leftover legacy of the OSS in World War II. Another problem that U.S. clandestine operations had in China was that it relied on former nationalist troops to do the infiltration. So Mr. Downey, Mr. Fecteau would send in Chinese nationalist troops. There were other offices of the OPC that would send in other former nationalist troops. And the problem is that the nationalist movement, after it lost the civil war in the mainland and left for Taiwan, was severely divided between two major groups. The first was Chiang Kai-shek's KMT that went to Taiwan and ruled Taiwan and claimed that Taiwan was the sole legitimate government. The government in Taipei was the sole legitimate government of all of China. That group partnered with elements of the CIA. My late friend and mentor, James Lilly, who was a classmate of Mr. Downey at Yale, worked with this group, the KMT wing, the Chiang Kai-shek wing of the insurgencies that were sent into China by the CIA. But Chiang Kai-shek was severely mistrusted in Washington, going back to the Civil War period on the mainland. And the United States felt kind of stuck with him. The Truman administration felt kind of stuck with him. The problem was that he had safely ensconced his government and military on Taiwan with a pledge to return to the mainland. And he had a lot of influential domestic supporters in the United States. We heard Professor Grasso, I did at the end of her talk about the Who Lost China furor, and that was on with a vengeance during the Korean War because of the rise of McCarthyism in the United States. So it was very difficult to abandon Chiang Kai-shek as a political force, an anti-communist political force in this period. But what the United States did is they worked with Chiang Kai-shek, but they also worked with this group that didn't get along with Chiang Kai-shek, which were former colleagues of Chiang Kai-shek on the mainland during the Civil War, who became disillusioned with Chiang Kai-shek's KMT, in large part because they were losing the Civil War. And the Americans believed these could constitute a third force, meaning not communists and not Chiang Kai-shek's KMT, but a third force that maybe could determine the future of China. This was the group that Mr. Fecteau and Mr. Downey was working with. They were often rivals with Chiang Kai-shek's KMT. There was real hatred between the groups. The third forces officers often blamed Chiang Kai-shek for losing the Civil War in the mainland, and Chiang Kai-shek saw the third force with some justification as a threat to his own rule on Taiwan and potentially in the future in China if he were ever to return there. And his son actually even plotted to assassinate one of the top third force generals at one point, according to historical reports. So the animosity was strong between these two groups, and the United States was working with both of them. And both groups had an institutional incentive to exaggerate how much influence they still had on the mainland after they were driven off the mainland, and to exaggerate the prospects of successful rebellion on the mainland, given their special connections within the PRC with the population. They had institutional reasons to do this. They had competitive reasons with each other to do this. And the US was relatively ignorant of developments on the mainland without their input. So the US was kind of beholden to them to get any kind of information. And they were clearly both exaggerating the degree of influence they had. Ambassador Lilly, who would become an ambassador later in his life, in his memoir, held the third force officers in particular disdain, saying that they had very little intel from the PRC, and they would often hand to the United States translated newspaper articles from the mainland, saying they had gained special intelligence from the mainland and claimed that they had gotten those through clandestine operations. So both of these groups were mobilized by the United States for penetration of the PRC. The record of failure of these groups is almost pure. The PRC figures said that the United States government inserted just over 200 former nationalist soldiers into the PRC. None of these operations produced a great deal from what I can tell in the intelligence realm. And the PRC claimed that all of them, to a person, were either captured or killed. And the US government, according to reports, did not question those figures from the PRC as being propagandistic or anything. So it appears that this particular aspect of US penetration of China was a failure. There were other forms of penetration. There was a KMT general, Li Mi, who operated after the loss on the mainland out of northern Laos and northern Burma, and made incursions into southwest China. From there, there's very little reported success from those incursions. The Chinese Communist forces were able to turn them back. There were other operations, though, and I'll talk briefly about them, and I don't talk about them that much in the book. This one I do talk about, but there are a few others. There were operations of Chinese POWs captured in the Korean War and sent to spy on Chinese forces and North Korean forces in the north during the Korean War, when there was that stalemate at the 38th parallel. What they would do is they would do aerial inserts of anywhere between 200 and 300 former POW or POWs who were anti-communist. They were deemed extremely anti-communist, as some of the Chinese, quite a few of the Chinese POWs in Korea were. This was called Unit 8240. They'd be dropped into North Korea and they would walk their way back to the 38th parallel and try to gain intelligence about military deployments that were facing the United States and its allies in the Korean War. They did get some useful intelligence, and some of these POWs survived, but the majority of them were killed or captured. And some useful intelligence was gained from them. And then there's Tibet. Tibet is a sensitive subject, obviously, and it was It was an operation that really took off later in the decade, in the middle of 1950s, and lasted until the late 1960s, when normalization started to happen. The U.S. pulled back from its support for Tibetan insurgents being inserted into the PRC. They were called Mustangs. They were trained by the CIA in Saipan first, where a lot of the KMT, former KMT soldiers were trained. And then in Colorado, a much more fitting environment for mountain training. And they were inserted from the west of China, from Nepal and India into Tibet, PRC Tibet. And they're called Mustangs because of the location in Nepal from which where their base was located. Hundreds of these guerrillas were given military training. Like I said, the U.S. would support them throughout the 1960s, and they would continue to fight for several years after that into the middle 1970s. There was one man in the CIA who ran that operation. I had the pleasure of meeting him when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University in the early 1990s. His name was John Kenneth Naus. And he was, like Mr. Downey, he was a critic of the operations in which he was involved upon reflection. And Mr. Downey did criticize the operations in which he was involved in his memoir. He reflected that he and his trainers knew very little about the geography and culture of Tibet before being given the reins of commanding these operations of Tibetan insurgents. He wrote a classic book on his experience called Orphans of the Cold War. He passed away, unfortunately, in 2016. And I'll read a clip from his obituary in the New York Times, which I think says a lot about the CIA efforts against China in the 1950s. It said, quote, "As Naus concedes, the CIA trainers knew next to nothing about Tibet," unquote. Quote, "No agent had been to Tibet. Only one knew any of its languages, and the maps they used to locate the first parachute drops for the Tibetans trained in Colorado had been drawn by a British expedition in 1904. They had some advantages in that Tibet had an indigenous resistance movement from when the Chinese communists first moved west into Sichuan and west into Tibet. And the Mustangs were really an offshoot of that. So they had their own resistance movement. It wasn't created by the United States. It was just led by United States officials, and the training was done by military experts in the United States. But they did have their own movement. They also had one advantage, is that, like in the OSS operations in Europe and in Asia, they mixed in with the local Tibetans, and many Tibetans saw the Han Chinese PRC forces as occupiers. So they did have that advantage as well. They didn't have great success. They didn't pose much of a challenge to PRC control of Tibet, so the destabilization process didn't really pan out. They did provide some useful intel to the US government that was starved for information about the PRC. And there was one famous mission in 1961 in which a PLA convoy was destroyed by the Mustangs, and many CCP documents were apparently seized in that raid. And that provided the United States some of the best intelligence it had about the suffering of the ongoing Great Leap Forward, which started in 1958 in China. There was some documentation about the mass killings that took place when the PLA crushed the uprising in Tibet in 1959. But I've never heard of another major accomplishment besides that 1961 raid. And when I taught at MIT, I spoke on a panel alongside a few elderly Mustangs living in exile in Nepal at the time at Harvard University on one Sunday morning. And these people clearly appreciate US support for Tibet on a general level. And these are really tough people, these guerrillas, and they're not prone to complaining. But spending the day with them, reading between the lines, I got the sense that they had been sent on some very unrealistic missions, which is consistent with Mr. Naus's recollection, at high expense to their comrades. So they had lost a lot of friends, and that they felt largely abandoned by the United States once the United States stopped actively supporting their operations. In other words, in their retirement from insurgency, they didn't feel particularly well supported by their American comrades. So I don't want to really talk about Xinjiang. We didn't have, as from what I can tell, we didn't have very good penetration of Xinjiang. And it seems like the Soviets, even though they were allies with the PRC, had much better penetration of Xinjiang than the United States. That's in the northwest of the PRC, for those who don't know the geography. So what are the lessons, the takeaway lessons? Takeaway lessons are really that the CIA was better at gathering and analyzing intelligence than it was at destabilizing and overthrowing governments like the PRC government. Even in terms of inserting people into countries at that time, it was more fruitful to gather intelligence than to undertake military operations designed to destabilize the political systems there. If China, that certainly was true for China. And in his memoir, Mr. Downey draws the conclusion from his own experience. His big takeaway in his interviews, et cetera, was that the CIA should focus on the mission of gathering intelligence and get out of the business of paramilitary operations for the purpose of subversion. I don't know how valid that is as a sweeping statement, but that was his takeaway. And at least in the case of China's clandestine operations in China in the 1950s, from the operations that James Lilly was involved in with the KMT forces, the operations that Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau were involved in with the Third Force, former KMT soldiers, from General Li Mi's incursions in the Southwest, and from the fairly large-scale operation with Tibet. It appears that Mr. Downey's wisdom is justified, that maybe this isn't the best use of resources. So I'll stop there because that was my task. I would be happy in the Q&A to talk about why it was so difficult to gain release of Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau based on my knowledge both of the way the Chinese communists view security and the diplomatic negotiations that took place between the United States and China in the 1950s and the early 1970s, how they differed and how eventually that difference produced the release of the two gentlemen. And I just want to close by saying, while their mission, the missions that they were involved in were not successful, Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau are absolute heroes. They accepted enormous risks to themselves out of patriotic fervor, and they have nothing but my greatest respect. And my first chapter in the co-authored book about Mr. Downey is entitled "An American Hero on a Fool's Mission." I don't think he was the fool. I think the mission was a fool's mission, but I think he was a hero, and he did the best he could to serve his country. And I respect him greatly. I respect Mr. Fecteau greatly, and I'm really honored to be included in this event by Mr. Woodward. I regret that I can't be there in person with you. I definitely would have been, but I'm doing work in Washington. When I thought about the work I'm doing in Washington yesterday and today, my sense was that Mr. Fecteau and Mr. Downey might want me to do that work and do this by Zoom rather than be in person. So thanks again for having me. Thanks to John, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Christensen, for taking it down to the next level for us, a little bit more granularity on these clandestine operations directed against China. We have time for questions. If anyone has a question, please wait for our Terrier Courier to give you the microphone, and if you'd be kind enough to identify yourself and fire away. I'm going to guess, Professor, you're also willing to entertain criticism and comment on your talk as well.
Always.
So
I need criticism. It'll make me stronger, I hope.
Well, you might get it because I see that Dr. Dujmovic has his hand up.
No criticism. Hi, Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can
Okay,
hear you.
good to see you. Yeah, no
Good to see you.
criticism. Thank you for that. That was brilliant, as your book is. Working in CIA archives, as I did as a staff historian, in the classified record, I got the sense that the program that you're talking about, which was called Merlin, this Third Force project, was something that CIA felt was imposed on it by the State Department, the NSC, and the Joint Chiefs. And there was also a sense that, this isn't really going to work, but, we got to do it. If you were to advise future leaders of U.S. intelligence, based on the history of covert action in China, what would you advise? And is it possible for CIA, and you were in the interagency, is it possible for CIA to say, we really shouldn't be doing this because we don't think it's going to work? I mean, what happens when the policymakers want it?
Well, I mean, the CIA is not a policy-making organization in that sense. I think that the best it can do with the policymakers is explain the potential costs and pitfalls of what they are advising them to do. In the same way, in my opinion, the military does. The military doesn't determine where you're going to fight, but a good general will tell a civilian leader who's a commander, in a sense, of the decision-making process, that here's why this military operation is unlikely to produce the results that you seek, and here are the potential costs of doing so. I think the CIA is in a very good position to do that, in that, as I said during the talk, I read the declassified equivalents of the NIE for China at those times, and it seems like the analytic branch of the CIA was saying that none of this was going to work. The stuff with Chiang Kai-shek's KMT wasn't going to work to destabilize the CCP regime to the point of having it collapse, and the Third Force wasn't going to do it either. I really believe, Dr. Dujmovic, that the incentive of the State Department and the military to some degree came out of frustration with Chiang Kai-shek and his government, that they wanted to do what they could, A, to learn about the mainland, and B, to destabilize the Chinese Communist Party if they could on the mainland. And they didn't trust Chiang Kai-shek as an honest broker in that, an honest partner in that endeavor. I think sometimes their criticisms of Chiang Kai-shek's KMT were excessive, but they had a kind of bitter experience with him on the mainland in the late 40s, and they were searching desperately to support something that wasn't communist in China, that was different from Chiang Kai-shek's KMT. And they had these ready partners, particularly in Hong Kong, who had been alienated from the KMT. They were former KMT officers, as you know, and they were alienated from the KMT because they didn't like Chiang Kai-shek. And that was music to the ears of the State Department when it got passed back there. And as you know, the policy planning staff was involved with the OPC, and you taught me that, actually, I should say. So getting that information back gave them some hope that this was another way to go. I don't want to say that the United States should never use clandestine operations anywhere or paramilitary operations anywhere, because I'm aware that when the conditions are right, the conditions weren't right in the early Cold War. I don't believe they were right from what I know, and I know much less about it, in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union either, because of the Leninist factor that I talked about. But my impression is that some paramilitary CIA people did quite a bit of good early on in Afghanistan in preparing for the initial invasion against the Taliban, because they were able to link up with pre-existing domestic resistance forces within the country and empower them to become much more effective. So I wouldn't dismiss the idea that paramilitary CIA activities could produce positive results simply because in the early Cold War they didn't, and they seemed ill-advised in the case of China. Maybe I can't make a broad generalization.
from the audience here, Kilachand? Does anyone have anything they want to ask? We do have a question from our remote audience, Professor Christensen, and this relates to comment on your book. And just by way of background for the audience here, the book is called Lost in the Cold War, co-authored by Jack Downey, Jack Downey's son, who is now a professor at Rochester University, and Professor Christensen. And the question is, from your book, it appears that the real impediment to the release of Jack Downey and Richard Fecteau was Secretary of State Dulles, rather than the Chinese.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a valid takeaway from the relevant chapters of the book that I wrote. But I would say that the first problem that they had in terms of difficulty in release is that they were deemed to be spies by the PRC. And as I suggested before, domestic security comes before national security, commonly considered by the Chinese Communist Party. So the fact that they were spies, they were considered particularly dangerous enemy elements, unlike a prisoner of war. If they had been prisoners of war, I think they would have been released much more quickly than if they were captured spies who were on a mission to assist in the destabilization and potential overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party was going to be hard to convince to let them go, but I do believe it was possible, and this is where I think the thrust of the question is valid. What the Chinese, what prevented them from getting released after you accept that basic line that they were considered to be serious violators of state security in China is the level of diplomatic contact the United States was willing to allow for the PRC, which the U.S. didn't recognize. The admission that they were spies, the Eisenhower administration continued with the Truman administration's position that they were not. Well, it wasn't the Truman administration's position because the Truman administration they didn't realize they were alive at that point after the crash. But the Eisenhower administration sustained this view that they were not spies and that they were being held in violation of international humanitarian norms as political pawns. And a third problem was that the PRC offered some ice-breaking opportunities that could have led to their release, including the exchange of journalists between the PRC and the United States, despite the lack of diplomatic relations. And these were rejected by the Eisenhower administration. So in the book, what I argue is that there was a real opportunity. Mr. Downey believed there was a real opportunity for his release in the period 1955 to 57, in part because of the B-29 crew that was also detained in China was released in that period. And that the Eisenhower administration and John Foster Dulles rejected the overtures from the PRC during the diplomatic talks between Ambassadors Johnson and Ambassador Wang Bingnan from China in Geneva in that period. And the problem that Mr. Downey saw was that when the PRC offered to consider these cases if the United States would consider the exchange of journalists between the two countries, Secretary of State Dulles labeled these offers as blackmail, and insisted that these people were innocent and deserved to be released unconditionally. And then the big question, John, is and to the questioner is, was there a real opportunity in 1955 to 1957 for their early release? And it is my strong belief, after reading the negotiating points of the Chinese side, which I was able to get a hold of, the negotiating points of the American side that I was able to get a hold of through declassification, that they really did have an opportunity to be released in the period of 1956 to 1957. And that when, in reflection, Ambassador Wang Bingnan, the Chinese negotiator, told Mr. Downey after his release that you could have been released in the 1950s if only John Foster Dulles had accepted these offers from my boss, Zhou Enlai. I believe it's probably true. And the main reason I believe it's true is something happened in early 1956 that's very hard to explain if this were not the case. The B-29 crew had been released in the late summer of 1955. And in early 1956, Mr. Downey, who had a life sentence, and Mr. Fecteau, who had a long sentence, but not a life sentence, were given a grand propaganda tour of China. They were taken out of the prison and given a grand propaganda tour. I call it a propaganda tour. Mr. Downey thought it was a bit of a propaganda tour. And the only reason you would take a person with a life sentence on a propaganda tour of China is if you were planning to release him and so that he would have more positive things to say about China upon his return to the United States. So I believe that CCP behavior strongly suggested that they were preparing to release these two prisoners before their sentences were done. And obviously for Mr. Downey, who was ever released, it was before his sentence was done because he had a life sentence. And that fit the diplomatic record that I was able to track down. So I do think there's a lot to that case. But I don't think you can remove the fact that the Chinese communists treated these two individuals as important threats to the most important security that they have, which is the security of their party regime at home. And they treated them differently than they would have treated prisoners of war from the Korean War or others, which would be a more standard national security threat.
Thank you. Any questions here from the audience at Kilachand?
Hi, my name's Jane Perlez. I was a correspondent in Beijing from 2012 to 2019, and I've read a couple of accounts of this period, including your book a while ago. But I'm not an expert. But my overwhelming impression is that Alan Dulles was very, very keen for these third forces, and he felt that the third force was really important for the United States to make an effort to destabilize the Mao regime, as you have said. What was it that made him so convinced that a third force could work, given all the impediments?
It's nice to meet you virtually, and you know, I do know who you are, and I appreciate your book review book in foreign affairs alongside our colleagues. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard. I would have to have studied Alan Dulles much more carefully as an individual. I'm a student of Robert Jervis, an expert on political psychology who passed away last year. And I would have had to have a better kind of psychological sense of Alan Dulles' own view. But I could say as a nation, and Alan Dulles was a leader in that nation in the 1950s, I think there was a very heady sense that something like the OSS could be reproduced, and that if American citizens couldn't do it in China for the reasons I cited, that they could use former KMT forces. There was also, I think, a understandable skepticism about Chiang Kai-shek's KMT being able to do it after their poor performance in the Civil War in the mainland. And I think there was a kind of almost excessive negative analysis of Chiang Kai-shek's political capabilities and his reliability by certainly the last part of the Truman administration and into the Eisenhower. So if you couldn't rely primarily on Chiang Kai-shek's KMT, and you believe that these types of operations could be successful because of the lessons of the last war and the OSS, then I guess the fallback position is you rely on the third force to the degree that you can. But I think Nicholas Dujmovic, I think he's right that the analytic side of the CIA maybe not Alan Dulles, but the analytics side of the CIA seemed very skeptical or very pessimistic that these operations could actually lead to a significant political change on the mainland.
From our live audience? Going once, going twice. We do have a question from one of our remote participants. Oh, this is a chance for you to put things in a historical perspective for us, Professor Christensen. The questioner wants to know, what similarities and differences do you see between U.S. government intelligence and subversion efforts today compared with the 1950s? So if you could compare and contrast. I think
Okay.
by subversion, I think we'll call that covert action.
Yeah, so John, here's my the Tom Christensen answer to this, which is the reason I'm able to talk about all the subjects I talked about today, about the 1950s and the 1960s, is because the information about those events are all declassified. So the big comparison is I can talk about the events in the 1950s and 60s, and I can't talk about anything now. Not that I'm a super knowledgeable person about all sorts of things that the CIA may or may not be doing around the world, but I cannot comment on anything that's not in the open space. And when I talked before about CIA paramilitary people operating in Afghanistan, that's all in the public domain. I can't talk about anything else besides that, I'm afraid.
Indeed. Any other questions here?
I'm sorry about that. You know, it's not pleasant, but it's just the reality.
Friend Joe Whipple is in the audience, and Joe and I were both operations officers in CIA. Now, it's true that Joe retired at a much, much higher grade than I did. But I think Joe will agree with me that there are not many CIA officers that really like to do covert actions for various reasons.
Well, my question is, when did us ever not knowing anything stop us from doing anything? Never. That goes for our military as well. But anyway,
Fair enough. Yes.
my only comment.
Fair enough. And that's you'll get the last word, Joe. Because
Yeah, I could barely hear that. But there is a lesson. There's a lesson in the comparison of the early 70s for the 1950s. I think that's a really important one, which is it's really I was a State Department person, right? And I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, and you know everything I say is my own opinion, but I currently have a formal advisory role at the State Department and have a badge and everything. But on the diplomacy side, I think it's pretty clear the way that that Mr. Fecteau and Mr. Downey were eventually we eventually gained the U.S. government eventually gained their release. That it's really important when you can to have direct diplomatic contacts at a high level with countries, even adversaries, and in some case, especially adversaries. And our unwillingness to interact with the PRC in the 1950s was a big part of the story I just told about why the negotiations in Geneva collapsed. I mean, there was this absolute obsession about not providing any kind of hint that we were recognizing the PRC as a legitimate negotiating partner at all. And that really colored the negotiations, and it really prevented things like accepting the outreach offered by Joe and Lai to exchange those journalists, which very well, I believe it would have gained their release in 1956-57. And it was rejected because of this idea that it's almost as if the adversary is disease that you can't touch. And I think that that's not good diplomacy. And I think the way the Nixon administration handled the cases was absolutely brilliant. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Kissinger about it. And one of the interesting things about the negotiations for the release is that they were kept extremely secret in a way that really pained the family of Mr. Downey. They, especially after Mr. Fecteau was released, Mr. Downey's family thought that the Nixon administration had forgotten about Mr. Downey. And that's all from the family archives that the Downey family was gracious enough to share with me. And I that secrecy level was absolutely necessary. And that's something that I hope citizens can understand, that secret negotiations with adversaries sometimes need to be kept secret. And the reason it was so important to keep them secret was that if it was publicized that the Nixon administration was negotiating for the release of Mr. Downey and Mr. Fecteau, it would look like they were making demands of the Chinese Communist Party for the release. And that would have greatly reduced, in my opinion, studying Chinese Communist Party politics and diplomacy, that would have greatly reduced the likelihood of their release. Because it would look like a weakness for the Chinese Communists to let them go, because it would have been demanded of them by the US government. And what National Security Advisor Kissinger and what President Nixon did instead was keep it secret, and instead of demanding anything, they expressed contrition. They said, we realize these people are guilty. We think it would be really good for our progress in US PRC relations during this rapprochement that we're undergoing for you to release them, but it's totally up to you. We think it would be smart for you to do it. We wouldn't make it a big costly thing. We wouldn't crow about it, but you ought to do it. And we're going to keep these negotiations absolutely secret, and we're not going to make any public statements about it. We hope you can release them early. And it worked. And I don't think it would have worked had they been public. So sometimes secret diplomacy is the best way.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Christensen. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we have to stop there. Thank you for joining us from Washington.
Everyone, I'm here to introduce Nicholas Dujmovic, our next speaker, who served for 26 years in the Central Intelligence Agency as an analyst, manager, and CIA staff historian. After retirement from the CIA in 2016, he created the Intelligence Studies program at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Dr. Dujmovic's unclassified work on CIA history has appeared in several intelligence journals and anthologies. Yale University published his collection of quotations in intelligence, The Literary Spy. Dr. Dujmovic taught at Catholic University until this year and has also taught at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and at American University School of International Service. Thank you for being here, and please give him your full attention.
Okay, you can hear me, I hope. So good afternoon. I am Nicholas Dujmovic, CIA retiree, former agency staff historian, which is as cool as it sounds, and a recovering university professor. I'm happy to be invited to this conference on early Cold War operations against China. The subject is important, among other things, because the communist regime still rules China. And as Ambassador Storella noted in his introductory remarks, history can provide valuable insights that can help us going forward, such as the efficacy of certain U.S. intelligence operations, which is what Professor Christensen talked eloquently about. But we're also here to discuss, going down to the next level, we're here to discuss a man, Richard George Fecteau, as he announced himself when he was captured by the Chinese in 1952. To everyone else, he is simply Dick Fecteau, Boston University alumnus and football player, later in life an assistant athletic director at BU, who as a CIA officer found himself in a really difficult situation when his CIA aircraft was shot down in Manchuria. Somehow Dick coped with 2 decades of imprisonment in communist China. Now, people my age look back at the years between our mid-20s and our mid-40s with a great deal of fondness. We remember those as great years.
For Dick Fecteau, that's when he was confined to a Chinese cell. It's great that BU is once again honoring this man. It's safe to say that no BU graduate ever did what Dick Fecteau did, or endured what he endured, because the only other person in Chinese captivity for 2 decades was Dick's CIA partner and friend, Jack Downey, who was a Yale graduate. Unfortunately, Dick Fecteau may be the greatest living American hero of the Cold War that few people have ever heard of. Now, I know many at BU and in the audience know a great deal about Dick Fecteau and his story. Others, not so much. And still others, maybe not at all. So I'm going to try to be all things to all people in this presentation. Dick Fecteau and Jack Downey, as we heard from Professor Christensen, joined CIA in 1951, like a lot of other young men of that era, wishing to serve their country in the years after World War II, with the Cold War ramping up and a hot war raging in Korea, as Professor Grasso noted. Dick had already traveled the world in the U.S. Merchant Marine before coming to BU. When I visited him at his house in Lynn, Massachusetts, he had a lot of souvenirs from those travels, including a wooden chest from Shanghai. So he'd been to China. He was patriotic and adventurous. Joining CIA's paramilitary covert action arm, OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, seemed just the thing for a former BU football player who had majored in physical education, but didn't want to teach or coach. He also had a new wife to support, as well as twin girls from a previous marriage. Dick was trained as a paramilitary officer, learning about weapons and, of course, learning how to jump out of perfectly good aircraft. And he was willing to be assigned anywhere in the world. After his CIA training, he ended up at a secret CIA base in the Far East that did covert operations against China. In fact, and this brings up an odd thing about the world I used to be in, the declassification of things that used to be classified. I said secret CIA based in the Far East. Not supposed to say where it is. But CIA declassified my article when it was still classified. They declassified it. And you can clearly see. Where's this? Where is this? Your words, not mine. Your words, not mine. Okay. It's an absurd world sometimes. It should be obvious that one does not join CIA for fame or publicity. And the first thing, and the last thing to remember about Dick Fecteau is that he was never in it for the attention. Not in 1951, when he joined CIA, not in 1971, when he was released from Chinese captivity, and not ever since then. Dick's Far East assignment, from a place I may not name, but put him into a CIA operation to train anti-communist Chinese agents who were dropped into mainland China to collect intelligence, first of all, and then, if possible, to support mainland Chinese opposition to the communist regime. This operation was part of a much wider CIA program called Merlin, and it's usually described in the literature as the Third Force Project, as Professor Christensen described it. The idea was to link up, have our trained ethnic Chinese agents link up with what was rumored to be substantial anti-communist forces on the mainland, and then provide help to this growing, it was thought, democratic opposition. That all turned out to be wishful thinking. In any case, in the summer and fall of 1952, two teams of Chinese agents were dropped onto the mainland into Manchuria. One team radioed back that they had valuable information to deliver through a courier who would be picked up by an aircraft, specifically through a system originally designed in the 1920s to pick up mail bags, the all-American system. That's That's this here. Picking up mailbags, All American Aviation. The OSS, during World War II, developed the concept of picking up people this way. And here, this bottom drawing is from an Army Air Forces manual showing this idea. You can see the agent to be retrieved is on the ground. Ignore the tropical setting, but you can see the agent in a harness. There are two poles with a line between it that is attached to the harness. Guys in the back of the aircraft would snag the line from the goalposts there and then winch them in. They'd actually done this with human beings, but it had not been done operationally. So again, ignore the palm trees here. What was going to happen was this plane, this is the actual plane that was owned by the Civil Air Transport, a CIA-owned proprietary airline. This was going to be a dangerous flight to a snowy, hilly, and wooded area of Manchuria. And again, this was Civil Air Transport, CAT. The CAT crew, which was designated to operate the winch in the back, they didn't have the proper clearances. So Dick and his buddy Jack were asked to be on this, a crewman on this mission to do the winch. Now Dick could have said no, but he agreed to it. What could go wrong? Just after midnight on November 30th, 1952, the unmarked C-47 approached the pickup zone, flying low and slow, nearly at its stall speed. Dick and Jack were in the back of the aircraft, ready to snag that Chinese agent with a harness contraption and pull him into the plane. CIA didn't realize that it was a trap. There had been indications that the Chinese agents on the ground had been caught, had been turned, were cooperating with Chinese security. But the CIA base chief at that place that I mentioned, that I indicated, was overeager. He ignored those warnings. He insisted that the mission go on, and which resulted in the loss of the plane and its pilots, CAT pilot, former Marine pilot Norm Swartz, and his co-pilot Bob Snoddy. Their stars are on the memorial wall at CIA headquarters. Now, because the Chinese security forces had captured the Chinese agents on the ground, they knew the plane was coming, and so it was easy to shoot it down. Dick survived the crash and was captured along with Jack. One of the Chinese soldiers took Dick's watch and struck him in the face. A security official told Dick he was lucky to be alive, but his future was very dark. The CIA men were bound and led away from the burning wreckage. Now, recently, Professor John Delury of Yonsei University, who's written a very good book, Agents of Subversion, he found in Chinese sources a photo of the moment of capture. I'm sorry to say, as a CIA staff historian, former CIA staff historian, that this image was unknown to CIA, had no idea. So when we made this movie in 2010 called Extraordinary Fidelity, and I encourage you to Google it, Google Extraordinary Fidelity and either China, prisoners, or CIA, and you'll find it. It's on YouTube. Well, it turns out we were pretty close. You know, Dick on the left and Jack on the right, both wearing hats. But it's fantastic find there. The CIA men were separated and imprisoned for 5 months in the provincial capital of Shenyang, then known as Mukden. Here you see their first official mugshots. Dick didn't know it, but he had suffered a stress fracture of his, I believe it was the right leg. The color photo is from our film. Again, Extraordinary Fidelity, you can Google it. Showing the men arriving at the prison in Shenyang. Standing in for the Chinese prison was Fort Washington in Maryland, an 1812 fort. Very nice. And we see more of the stills from that film here, based on later debriefings of the men. In that prison, the men endured interrogations nightly, typically lasting from 4 to 6 hours, but sometimes much longer, sometimes as long as 24 hours straight. Dick reported that he had been usually sleep deprived, which was deliberate. Sometimes he would pass out from being forced to stand for hours. He was forced constantly to wear heavy leg irons. And for 5 months, he could not take a bath. That's pretty nasty. The food was simple and inadequate. Dick lost 75 pounds. Yes, he was a strapping 190-pound former football player, reduced to a less than 120-pound captive. With no idea of what lay ahead, Dick remembers being despondent, even fatalistic. Now, he was not beaten or tortured, but his captors treated him with extreme hostility, often screaming at him. He was told that the rules of war do not apply to him, that he was missing, that no one knew where he was, or whether he was even alive. And the Chinese were right, indeed. When the plane failed to return, CIA and the US government assumed it had been lost with all aboard. Even before the mission, CIA failed the men by not preparing them for this kind of situation. They were given an inadequate cover story. And if you know anything about CIA operations, you know that cover is key. It was really bad. They were to say, if they were caught, they were to say they were crewmen on a cat commercial flight, and they were based at a Japanese airfield, neither of them had been to, and so they could not describe it. And then, in the middle of the interrogations, the US government announced that they were missing this plane, and the two guys in the back were both Department of the Army civilians. This did not go well with the Chinese interrogators. Worse yet, Dick and Jack had been told that if they were captured by the communists, they would be eventually forced to talk. So they might as well tell everything. Not very helpful for two guys who really wanted to keep secret operations secret. Dick remembers being angry at how unprepared they were. Now, both men eventually did admit to being CIA. Their various cover stories didn't hold up. But Dick very cleverly kept information from the Chinese. He claimed he was a brand new CIA employee of just a couple of months instead of more than a year. He didn't know much about operations. This was not exactly true. And when the interrogators pressed him for names and detailed descriptions of his fellow CIA officers, Dick complied, sort of. He gave them the names, descriptions, personal information of 24 guys he knew very well, the Boston University football team. I don't know whether he threw in a couple of coaches as well. Dick rightly figured that there was no danger to them from the Chinese, whereas his CIA buddies were working in the region. Dick was able to maintain this fiction for the rest of his confinement. At first, he was ashamed of capitulating and admitting his CIA affiliation, but over time, he considered his cover confession a victory over his captors, and it became a constant source of personal morale for him for almost 20 years. In the interrogations, Dick also gained time to think between questions simply by using American slang. His lack of enunciation, his bad neighborhood English, confused them, and so he could gain time in interrogations. Dick used his Boston accent as an effective tool. He also enjoyed angering one particular interrogator simply by smiling at him. When he was told to sign the transcript of his statements, he used unnatural, highly stilted handwriting, quite in contrast to the beautiful cursive that he learned in the Lynn public school system. Dick later told us that he never lost his sense of being a CIA officer, and so he saw his personal struggle with the interrogators as a greater contest between CIA and the Chinese Security Service. When the CAT aircraft with it presumed lost, and no indication from the Chinese that they were holding survivors, exactly 1 year after the mission failed to return, CIA made the legal determination that Dick and Jack were dead. Letters were sent to the families, letters of condolences. insurance policy, death benefits were paid, but they were alive. They were still being interrogated. After another year, there was a show trial, which was publicized. In late 1954, and Beijing announced that it was holding these CIA men, that they had been convicted of espionage and inciting insurrection, and that they had been sentenced, Jack Downey to life, Dick to 20 years imprisonment. And there's no truth to the myth. That's because Jack went to Yale and Dick went to BU. It was because they knew that Jack had trained these Chinese agents. They knew all about Jack Downey, and they assigned the role of leadership to Jack Downey. Dick was the assistant chief culprit. So CIA was surprised at this revelation, but scrambled to reinstate both men to the workforce, to start paying them, and also to develop supportive relationships with the families, in Dick's case, with his former wife and his twin daughters, as well as with his aging parents who still lived in Lynn. After the trial, Dick was allowed to write home and receive letters. To his great distress, he learned that his second wife had died in a house fire. He was devastated, but it did not defeat him. He never considered suicide. The families provided CIA with copies of the letters they received, and CIA carefully analyzed these letters to help us determine the mental state of the men, and found that Dick was keeping his sanity intact. He would often express dark humor in subtle ways in his letters so they could clear the Chinese censors. So without any preparation for this ordeal, Dick found ways to cope and even overcome the bad hand that fate had dealt him. I mean, how do you survive 20 years almost in prison that way? Over the long years of his imprisonment, Dick rebelled in ways that seem astounding. He insisted that his cover confession was all he had to say. Ain't got nothing else, even though the Chinese thought he was holding back, which of course he was. Once an interrogator called him a coward, Dick looked him in the eye and said, "Put me up in front of a firing squad. Go ahead." When the guards wanted him to sit on his cot and stare at the wall to reflect on his crimes, he got up and started pacing his cell. He refused to bow as required, and whenever a guard tried to force Dick's head down, he always whirled around and told him never to touch him again. This infuriated the guards, but eventually they stopped trying to make Dick bow down. If they shoved him, Dick usually shoved back, even when they were armed with machine guns. Dick's behavior was so out of character from the docility of other prisoners that the Chinese labeled him aggressive. It's true that Dick enjoyed baiting the guards, for example, by pretending he did something wrong when he hadn't, and then looking guilty about it. He ignored their calls to get moving, doing so only when they came to him. He engaged in shouting matches with one or several guards at once, and when the prison official showed up, Dick would change tack completely, apologizing profusely, saying the guards were wonderfully humane and efficient. They didn't know what to do. Dick was sent back to his cell. I think the Chinese prison officials thought Dick Fecteau was a little crazy. No matter how depressed or dejected Dick got, he didn't complain or let on what he was thinking. He learned early on that if he complained about something, he got more of it. He once turned back some food. "You didn't like that food?" they asked. "Too many tomatoes," he said, and they were green. For weeks afterwards, all he saw were green tomatoes. After that, whenever the Chinese officials asked about food or his living conditions, he replied with adequate or satisfactory. For much of his confinement, Dick was alone in a small cell with sparse furnishings. A 15-watt light bulb burned constantly. The cells that he occupied were drafty and dirty. During the winter, he was constantly cold, and in summer weather, it was miserably hot, and he was sweaty. In the early years, he was allowed one bath a month, but later on that improved to once a week. Breakfast was porridge and bland bread. Lunch was cabbage soup and some vegetables. Dinner was the same, sometimes with a chunk of mystery meat or fish. Rice was commonplace, but it often had maggots in it. Dick got good at picking them out. But he still, occasionally, he got intestinal worms. Food shortages in China were reflected in the prison diet. After one bad harvest, they were served just boiled cabbage for 2 months straight. He was allowed to walk in the courtyard a few times a week. Medical care was usually poor and neglectful. The prison doctor usually diagnosed any medical complaint by saying, "You have syphilis." He didn't. Over the years, Dick did develop eye problems. His teeth and gums suffered. He contracted rheumatism, but not syphilis. Even so, amidst all this, Dick worked out daily. Dick always said that the daily physical exercise regimen was one of the best things he did. It toughened his body, it also toughened his mind, and it helped both his sleep and his appetite. After he returned, American doctors were astounded at his physical shape. For most of his imprisonment, Dick was allowed to write just one letter per month and to receive just one. His parents could send 2 small packages every month with vitamins, foodstuffs, and coffee to supplement his prison diet, as well as reading material approved by the Chinese censor. And by the way, CIA made sure that families didn't pay for the packages. CIA paid for it. Prison conditions worsened with the onset of China's Cultural Revolution in 1966. Dick and Jack had to participate in ideological study sessions. Dick was warned that he wouldn't leave the prison until he was re-educated. As usual, Dick fooled the system by outwardly appearing to cooperate while keeping his real thoughts to himself. Dick has consistently described his prison experience as boring, and it was, mostly, particularly in the first 2 years when he was denied all reading materials, and in the last years when he was denied Western reading material. Chinese prison was designed to be mind-numbingly routine. But Dick did not succumb to the boredom. He actually did quite a lot in prison, reading voraciously when it was allowed, and even if it was Lenin or Marx, he would read that. Writing letters, using his imagination to take himself out of his cell, thinking about a drive from Lynn to Gloucester and back. Exercising in his cell for up to an hour or even more per day. Communicating secretly with the other prisoners. They developed a secret communication system. Interacting with the guards, positively and negatively. They even did some gardening and grew a few vegetables. By staying busy with the activities that he could control, Dick found that though the weeks passed slowly, the months went by fast. Mostly, and I think this is key to figuring out Dick Fecteau, he kept faith. Dick kept faith with himself, with his pal Jack, who he could monitor because they would cough and figure out where each one was in the cell block because they were never together. He kept faith with his family, his agency affiliation, and his country. Now, I don't just mean that Dick believed that CIA was doing everything it could to get him out and that eventually he would get out. He did believe those things, and those things were true. Keeping faith is more than just belief, more than just believing in something. It really means being faithful to something. And being faithful is a choice. He chose not to believe what his captors were telling him. He chose never to feel abandoned. Another way to put this is that Dick always had a sense of duty, not as something imposed, but as a free choice that recognizes obligations based on chosen relationships. It's really a sense of belonging and choosing to belong. And I think it was this sense of obligation, his choice to remain faithful and true to his country, to the agency, to Jack, and to his family, that this was the primary factor in Dick's surviving all those years in Chinese prison. I don't know how else to explain it. In the renowned book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl wrote about his own survival in Nazi prison camps. Now, I am not comparing what Dick experienced to what the victims of Nazi genocide suffered, not at all. Even so, Frankl's words have meaning for everyone, and they apply to Dick Fecteau. Those who survived, Frankl writes, were those who knew they had a reason to live, who had not given up. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Dick's choosing to be faithful to others, that was his why. This also reassured him that he was still in control of himself. Yes, his physical location and his movements were directed by his captors, but they couldn't touch what he was thinking. Frankl also wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Dick chose his own attitude. And he told us that his spirit of defiance came from his upbringing, his love of country, and the sense that anyone insulting America was insulting him personally. Another factor in Dick's survival seems incongruous. In that bleak environment, Dick found humor. When he and Jack Downey were standing together during their show trial, having not seen each other for 2 years since their capture, Dick noticed that Jack, like himself, was dressed in a new black Mao suit. Dick whispered, "Jack, who's your tailor?" When he learned through the mail that Yale had lost a football game, especially to Harvard, Dick got a kick of teasing Jack about it. Jack had been on the Yale football team. He would write the score in dust, where Jack would find it. Dick enjoyed teaching American slang to a couple of the nicer guards, and he got one of them to burst into Jack's cell, shouting a phrase not suitable for polite company. We can say it alluded to coprophagi, a Greek word meaning to eat dung. Dick enjoyed observing ironies and incongruities, such as when he was given a book by an Australian leftist describing the glowing, wonderful prison conditions in China, which were quite at variance with what Dick knew from his own firsthand experience. Now, as a former CIA officer and staff historian, I must point out that the agency, having made some terrible mistakes that led to Dick and Jack's imprisonment and made it worse, the agency felt a real obligation to them and their families and did everything it could to make amends. From the moment CIA learned the men were alive, the agency worked constantly until their release to benefit their financial situation, including promoting them with their peers, supplementing their salaries with high cost of living supplements, as if they were in Tokyo or someplace instead of languishing in a Chinese cell, and then investing their earnings. The agency made sure that Dick's twin girls had birthday and Christmas presents from him, and that their education was paid for. CIA personnel officers made frequent visits to the family once they observed that Dick's aging parents were driving around in a real clunker, a really old car. And so they concluded that, well, Dick would want to make life better for them, so they made sure that Dick bought his parents a new car. As Professor Grasso mentioned, U.S.-Chinese relations really entered a new era when the Nixon administration initiated overtures to Beijing. So in late 1971, when the Chinese informed Dick that he was going to be released, his first thought was whether Jack Downey would be released with him. And he said so to the prison officials, who said, no, Downey is going to be staying longer. Dick asked whether he could leave Jack his belongings. When Dick returned to the United States, he was mobbed by the media, but was very careful not to say anything about his imprisonment that might make it more difficult for Jack. When Jack Downey was released in 1973, Dick gave a letter to the CIA official who was going out to meet Jack in Hong Kong, in which Dick explained the process and what to watch out for, mostly the media. Sorry, Jane. After Dick returned, he was, of course, eager to get on with his life and reconnect with his daughters, his former wife, his parents. He was now a CIA retiree, and his accumulated savings amounted to 7 times his annual salary as a GS-14. Dick did not have to work, but he agreed to come back to the agency for extensive debriefings at CIA to help the agency understand what he had been through. These debriefings contributed to how CIA trained its officers who might find themselves in captivity. There was a course called Enduring Communist Imprisonment. Now, Dick could have said, no thanks, I really don't want to relive all that. I have other priorities now. But he wanted to help. Again, this was Dick's sense of obligation based on relationships. Here's his badge photo from that period. And on the right, he's getting an award from CIA Director William Colby. Remember that photo. So among Dick's recommendations for potential American prisoners, exercise daily. If you can get them, take vitamin pills to supplement your diet. And if at all possible, floss regularly. For CIA's instructors, he was adamant, don't tell our people you might as well talk. No, tell them instead to give away as little as possible. Get away with as much as you can. If you can withhold even one name from them, it makes all the difference. You might save that person or that operation. Knowing you haven't told everything, at least will be good for your morale. Dick was naturally a quiet person, more so after the China experience, but he sought opportunities to work with people and to serve. He applied to be a parole officer, but was turned down by a judge because he had spent time in prison. As we know, he ended up at his beloved Boston University as an assistant athletic director, and we'll hear about his inspiring service to this university and its athletic program. Dick served the BU athletic department until 1989. I love this photo of him at work. You can see the CIA photo with Colby on the wall there. After his retirement from BU, Dick was faithfully kept attending the BU home games, football games. He kept in touch with old friends and was close to family. But apparently there was something about Dick that led to his outliving everyone. One by one, they all died. All his friends are gone, as are his brothers, his wife, and even recently his 2 twin daughters who had serious health problems. In the Puritan Lawn Memorial Park in Peabody, you can find the Fecteau family marker with 4 names, only Dick's. That doesn't have a date of death yet. Dick is the last man standing from his era. As a CIA historian, I was privileged to get to know him. I found out quickly that Dick was not a person to cash in on his experience. He never sought the limelight. He never wrote a book and gave only one media interview after his return. When I first contacted him in 2007 about a historical study I was going to publish on his case, he sighed and said words to the effect of, okay, but I would prefer if you didn't. I sent him the draft of the unclassified version. He was happy I didn't hype the story too much, but even so, he said, I would prefer if you didn't. When CIA decided to make that internal documentary film of the story for the agency workforce, he and Jack agreed to be interviewed for the film because it was for CIA. They would do anything for CIA, which is remarkable. But when I had the unhappy task of calling Dick to say, there's this thing called Freedom of Information Act, and we're being forced to release it to the public, he said, I understand, but I still prefer if you didn't. And once again, I'm going to be critical of my former employer. It's what I did when I was a staff historian as well. was a responsibility. Now, back in 1973, when Dick and Jack had been recommended for an award, they were actually recommended for the Intelligence Star, which is the agency's version equivalent of the Silver Star. It's for valor. But CIA Director William Colby, who was odd, downgraded the award to the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the DIM, which actually is not particularly distinguished. It's a fairly common award for career excellence. It's for performance of outstanding services that constitute a major contribution to CIA's mission. I hope I'm not offending anybody in this room by saying it's an award for high-performing intelligence bureaucrats. It is not an award for valor. Well, I'm happy to say that I was just part of, an internal movement at CIA to right this wrong. And 40 years after receiving the DIM from Colby, Dick and Jack were awarded the Distinguished Intelligence Cross, CIA's highest award for valor, from Director John Brennan. The DIC is the agency's equivalent of the Medal of Honor. And the phrases associated with that award are extraordinary heroism, conspicuous fortitude, and exemplary courage. This was the right award. And it was a fitting, if delayed, recognition. Even so, when I told Dick he was going to get this award, he said, okay, if you want, but I would prefer if you didn't. In the photo, you can see that he's amused by it all. He thought he looked smug in the photo. He said, as if I deserved this thing. Yes, you did, Dick. Yes, you did. After that ceremony, which was in November of 2013, Dick and Jack caught up with old friends over a beer. CIA is full of great and unknown stories that intersect. And the man on the left is a man named Lucius. He was a legendary CIA case officer and knew Dick and Jack from before the shoot down, and they picked up their friendship afterwards. He's now deceased, but his life story, Lucius's life story, would make a great book all by itself. So after that, I continued to stay in touch with Dick, and despite the fact I wouldn't leave him alone, he would return my calls. I would wish him a happy birthday. We exchanged Christmas cards. Dick's humor, which helped him defeat Chinese imprisonment, never left him. In one Christmas card, he wrote, "Nick, check the back of this card. It's from Santa's little workshop." The back of the card said, "Made in China." In another card, he was saying that so many of his family members had died. He wrote, "I'm still here. Was it the Chinese food?" Dick always asked me to pass his regards to CIA's paramilitary officers, whom he called my PM guys. They're the very best. Whenever I told him he was an inspiration to so many people in CIA and elsewhere, he would say, "Well, I'm no hero. I just did my job." The last time I talked with Dick was just after the 70th anniversary of his capture in Manchuria. 70th anniversary. A columnist, David Shribman, had written a nice tribute to Dick that appeared in newspapers across the country, and including in his hometown paper in Lynn. I asked Dick if he had read the piece. He said yes, but he didn't think much about it. I said, "You never wanted attention." He said, "That's right." In our times, everyone wants to be famous. Dick Fecteau just wants to be himself. Dick told me he still works out daily, with free weights on his universal gym, walking his treadmill, setting a good example by alternating strength with cardio. Dick is countercultural in many ways. In an era of tweets and reduced attention spans, he continues to read serious stuff: a history of Stonehenge, a book on Greenland, a history of U.S. air operations in World War II, a work on modern Chinese history, along with the Boston Globe and the New Yorker. We're talking about somebody in his mid-90s. I've got 30 years to go. I hope I'm still as sharp. Dick Fecteau, he may have spent the prime of his youth in a Chinese cell, but he never let that experience slow him down. He made the most of the bad hand that life had dealt him, and he walked away from it and restarted life on his own terms. What a man. What a hero. God bless Dick Fecteau. So I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions about Dick, his China experience, his relationship with CIA, the film we made, and so forth. So thank you.
Nick, does anybody in the audience have a question for Nick? I see Grant Rhodes' hand is up. Our terrier will get you the microphone. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for those remarks of a remarkable story. One point of detail, where was the prison where he was in prison? You might have said, but I missed that. Was that in Shenyang?
For the first 5 months, I'm sorry, I didn't fill in all the details. They were moved to Beijing, where over the course of the years, they were in 3 separate prisons, depending on how you count, because one prison was extensively renovated. I have that information at home. I think one of them was the main municipal prison in center of China, Beijing, another on the outskirts. I'm not an expert on the Chinese penal system, so I don't really know.
That gives a good idea, all in North China. And the more complex question is, if he's reading a modern history of China, did you catch any glimpse of how he thinks about China today?
I did not. He doesn't talk a lot, so I would hesitate to infer anything from what he said. He was actually reading John Delury's book, and then he was going to read Professor Christensen's co-authored work as well. But I didn't get a book review from him. I would have loved that. Yeah.
Nick, anyone in the audience have any questions for him about the very unique perspective on Dick Fecteau's experience in China? Any questions? You want to have a final word, Nick?
I said it. Anyway, Google the movie. It's better than History Channel.
Yeah, and just so we have it on the record, the movie is Extraordinary Fidelity. And if you Google Extraordinary Fidelity, China, prisoner, CIA, you will find it on YouTube. It's about an hour long and very well done. You have a question? Yeah, it's available free of charge on YouTube, and it's quite good.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have the honor and privilege to introduce Jack Parker, a legendary figure in American hockey who coached 1,484 games at the NCAA Division I level with Boston University, winning 897 games over the course of 40 seasons and amassing a .643 winning percentage, 3 national championships, 11 conference titles, and 21 Beanpot Tournament crowns. He retired after the 2012-2013 season as one of only 3 coaches to be named a 3-time recipient of the Spencer Penrose Award as the NCAA Division I Coach of the Year, winning in 1975, 1978, and 2009. Upon his departure from the coaching ranks, Jack Parker had the 3rd most victories in NCAA history, the 4th best winning percentage among NCAA Division I coaches with more than 1,000 games behind the bench, and the most wins at one school, that being 897. Please welcome Jack Parker.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing to the presentation and award that Dick's going to receive on Saturday. I am Jack Parker. I was the co-chair for 40 years. I'm also CIA, Catholic, Irish, and alcoholic. I was coaching at BU for about 4 years when I first met Dick Fecteau. He was hired as an assistant athletic director. And there wasn't much fanfare about his background. There was a little bit of talk that he was a prisoner of war. There was a little bit of talk that he was CIA. But he wasn't presented to the staff or to the coaches as anything but the new assistant AD. And I didn't have much interaction with him because the hockey team did not report to him. So I didn't really get to know him very well for a while. I'll always see him at different coaches and staff meetings and chatted up a little bit, but didn't get much personal conversation going with him. And then, but my early observations were, I was amazed at how soft-spoken he was, how quiet he was, how reserved he was. I noticed that he didn't like noise and that he didn't like being in crowded rooms. But other than that, he seemed normal. He was just like anybody else in the department, not looking for recognition, not playing the poor me attitude, but he was just Dick Fecteau, assistant AD. He was brought on by John Simpson, who was a teammate of his at BU, playing football in the early 50s. And John was the new athletic director, and he thought it would be a good idea. Dick was, after he was released, he was in the process of being debriefed for a while, and then he was in the process of still working at the CIA for a while, and then he retired. And as was mentioned, he probably didn't need a job, but he wanted something to do, and John was a close enough friend and thought that Dick would be an asset to the department and thought that Dick would get a big kick out of being around athletics again. So we hired him, and he was on the staff, and he was there, and he seemed to fit in pretty easily with everybody. I don't know if it was 3 or 4 years into it, maybe 2 years into it. Our football coach had a party at his house around Christmas time, and he invited all the head coaches and their wives, all the ADs, assistant ADs, and their wives, their significant others, whoever. And at that time, my first wife had died, and Dick was not reunited with his wife yet. So we went to the party, and we were the only guys without our spouses. And we had a nice meal. It was a Christmas time. It was a great time. It was kind of a bonding for the department. The AD was there, obviously, John Simpson and Dottie. And then Rick Taylor brought out the game Trivial Pursuit and thought that it would be a good idea. This would be a party game for us. And I'm sure you've heard of the game. It's about trivia. And the way they decided to do it was everybody would match up with their spouse, except Dick and I, who didn't have spouses, so we matched up with each other. So Dick was my partner in Trivial Pursuit that night. And we didn't get into the game 10 minutes, and I realized he didn't know jack shit about what anything was going on, what happened to Dick, And that's what really jumped out at me, 52 to 72, there was a lot of things that happened. And he was incommunicado somewhere across the world. That became my objective from then on with Dick. The very next day, I went into his office. Hey, I got to talk to you for a minute, Dick. You were lousy last night. And it dawned on me why. And I was thinking about it all night. A lot of things happened while you were gone. We put a man on the moon. Kennedy got assassinated. What surprised you the most when you came home? And without blinking an eye, he says, Tommy McGee being Speaker of the House in the state of Massachusetts. I said, why did that surprise you so much? He says, when I left Lynn in 52, Tommy had a big problem with alcohol. And he was out of a job, and he was kind of down and out and useless. And when I come back, he was Speaker of the House. What happened was he went to Alcoholics Anonymous, got sober, got a job, got elected as a rep from Lynn, and then became Speaker of the House. That surprised me more than anything. I was shocked at that. And, geez, a lot of other things happened, Dick, But we get into that later on. I would like to add, I would then make it my my entertainment every once in a while to go find Dick. Let's go have lunch. Let's have a coffee. And I already have in my mind questions I was going to ask him about what, because he never would talk about it. He never was somebody, hey, let me tell you what happened here. You had to bring it up to him, and you had to bring it up with just you and him. He wasn't talking about it in front of anybody else. So one day we were having a coffee, and I said, I got to ask you something, Dick. 9 years in solitary confinement. 6 straight years in solitary confinement. 19 years in a Chinese prison camp. How did you come out sane? How did you work that? He said, well, when I wasn't in solitary, they give me books to read, and I loved reading, and I'd read anything they gave me. But when I was in solitary, I would just exercise and try to think of things, keep my body going and keep my mind going. So what do you mean by exercise? Well, I do, 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, 50 squats. I said, yeah, that takes 15 minutes tops. Well, I do it every 2 hours. And then as far as my mental capacity was concerned, I would just try to think of things. And it was already mentioned that he said to me, I used to try to, I said, like what? What were you thinking about? And he said, well, I would try to think of myself driving from my home in Lynn to Boston University. And if you, I don't know if you're from Massachusetts, but every town has the same sign, entering Canton or entering Rockport or entering, it all says Massachusetts and a certain sign on it. They're all exactly the same, but it also tells you the town you're entering. And I'd be driving, and I used to leave and leave Lynn and go through Swampscott and then back through Lynn again. So I'd see entering Swampscott, then entering Lynn, and then entering Revere, and then entering East Boston, and then entering Boston. And then I would change the route. And I would go down Route 1, and I would see entering Saugus, and entering Peabody, and then entering Charlestown. Okay. So you were thinking about driving. No, I was thinking about a lot of things. Like what? What else? He said, well, I bet you I spent 1.5 years trying to figure out who sat in front of me in the 5th grade. So what do you mean? He said, well, I knew my 5th grade class. I remember my teacher. I knew my best. I sat in the 5th seat, middle row. My best friend sat to my right over here in the 7th seat. And there was a girl that sat in front of me. And for a long time, I just would set aside time to try to remember things that would get me to think of who that girl was. 1.5 years, I never figured it out. I could figure out a lot of other things in that room, but I couldn't even picture her face. I could just see the back of her head. I knew she had blonde hair. Oh, wow. When you come home, did you find out? He said, what'd I give a shit then? Yeah, I see your point. I see your point. I'm sorry. Sorry I asked that. He would talk about, I asked him one time about interrogation. I said, they pull your fingernails out, or, stuff you see in the movies, He said, no. He said, but, they'd hit you a little bit, but mostly it was just screaming at you and yelling at you and making like they were going to hit you. He said, one time I got hit, I got beat up pretty good because they put him in they allowed him to go out in the walkway, in the yard, and it was after a big snowstorm. He was out walking, he was a little cold, obviously, and he decided to make a snowman by himself. He made this huge snowman, and he made it really realistic with oversized genitals and etc. And they went nuts because they thought he was immoral, and they come in and beat up the snowman first, and then beat him up. So he says, but that was the only time they ever really went after me with physical stuff. But they would constantly be yelling at me, and he said, before we ever went to trial, they were constantly interrogating us about different subjects. But one of the things they always wanted to know was who was the leader. And we always, we're the same, we joined the same time with the same rank and, there's no leader here. We're both the same. And it was, they just couldn't fit. They figured one of them had to be the leader, and they were always coming back to that. Who's the leader? And the way I heard it from Dick was maybe he was telling a different story at the time because it was not quite what was set up here earlier. But Dick said about 9 months into it, sometimes they'd be interrogated by them in different rooms, sometimes they'd be interrogated together, sometimes they were in different prisons, but they were always getting interrogated, and they were always being asked the same question, who's the leader? And this particular time, they were sitting like right here, And the interrogator was in front of them talking to him, and behind them they had like a stage with a dais with a bunch of generals and officials behind them. And the interrogator would ask him questions, and he'd turn around and explain it to the people behind him, the generals, etc. And all right, who's the leader? Come on, you ask us that every time. We're not, we're both the same. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Mr. Fecteau, how many children do you have? Mr. Fecteau, Dick would say, I have twin daughters, 2 daughters. Okay. And Mr. Downey, how many children do you have? Downey, I think he had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. Okay. All right, who's the leader? Oh, come on, for crying out loud, Constant, every third question, who's the leader? So finally they said to him, the guy said to him, and where did you go to school, Mr. Downey? Mr. Fecteau. And Fecteau said, I went to Boston University. And then he said, and where did you go to school, Mr. Downey? And Downey said, I went to Yale. And he immediately turned around, looked at his generals and said, he's the leader. So one of my best friends in coaching is a guy named Tim Taylor. He's no longer with us. He was a great coach, a fabulous guy. When I was an assistant coach at BU, he was an assistant coach at Harvard. And then when I became the head coach at BU, he became the head coach at Yale. And so I used to recruit against Yale and against Timmy. And I used to always tell Timmy, I'm going to tell these kids, what hell is Yale going to get you? You're going to get more jail time if you go to Yale. There's no other advantage in going to Yale. But it was, so Dick got 20 years and Downing got life. And that is amazing. Dick got out in 19, Downing got out in 20, I think, or maybe 21. I'm not sure. But I know that there are two of the very few people in New England who think Dick Nixon's a great guy. Because of Dixon's diplomacy, Dixon's administration's diplomacy, they opened up relationships with Red China again, and they finally got to come home. I remember one time asking him about interrogating, did you ever think of giving in? Did you ever think of just saying, I'll tell him anything I want? The famous comedian used to talk about that, talk about being interrogated. And what? What are they going to do with that hot poker? They're not going to put that hot poker up that guy's ass, are they? I'll tell them anything they want. I'll make up secrets if they want me to, Dick, did you ever think of just, he says, yeah, I thought about it all the time. He says, I was just lucky. I was just lucky most of the time. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I remember thinking to myself, if they start on me today and they start yelling and screaming at me, I'll tell them whatever they want. But that was the one day they'd be nice to me. And I was just lucky because then I'd get my resolve back and next time I could take it again. I said, what do you mean they'd be nice to you? Well, they would ask you. I remember one time they marched me out of my cell. I was in solitary. Marched me out of my cell, sat me down in a different room, looked at me and said, how was your year? And I said, all right, pretty good. You have any complaints? It was already mentioned. He said, yeah, I don't like tomatoes. Seems like every meal I get tomatoes. And I'm tired of tomatoes. So they said, well, take care of that then. Thank you. And for the next 3 months, every single meal, all we got was tomatoes. I said, you must have been pissed. I was pissed at myself, he said. I said, why? He said, I should have told him I hated lobster. He told me one time they called him out and sat him down and just stared at him. Didn't say a word to him. Thought it was an interrogation, but there wasn't. He was just staring at him. And then finally they just said, they shot your president today. And then they had him get up and march back to the stuff. I said, what'd you think of that? He said, well, I didn't know who the president was, obviously. I had no idea. I didn't know if he was shot and dead. I just know that there must have been an assassination attempt, but I didn't know what happened to him. And I never found out until I came home that it was Kennedy and he was assassinated. But it was a long time sitting in that cell wondering, what's going on in my country? What's going on there? The amount of fortitude and toughness that it took to sit there all those years and wondering, you know, what's going on with his wife, what's going on with his kids, what's going on, and what's going on with my country. They shot your president today. Beyond belief to me, I would have been making up secrets, I'll tell you that. Just general observations about Dick when we worked together for, I think, about 15 years. He came to all the BU home games, football, basketball, hockey. Here's a guy that didn't like noise and didn't like crowds, but he loved coming to the games. And he was an athlete himself. He loved athletics. He was in the BU again, and he wanted the teams to have success. But he never would come around after a big win to congratulate me or, you know, how's it going? That was terrific. But after a tough loss, he always made sure he came around. Might not have been right after the game, might have been the next day he'd come find me in my office just to see how I was doing. And, you know, he didn't have to say it, but whenever he came around to see how I was doing, I always felt he was saying to me, you know, this isn't the worst thing that could happen to you, Jack. A loss here is not the worst thing that could happen to you. There's other things that are worse. Nothing seemed to bother him. Nothing seemed to rattle him, for obvious reasons. He'd already been rattled for a long, long time, and they didn't get to him. So when he was around BU, he was always even keel. He was always quiet, calm, observant, and never, ever wanted to stand out or act like he was important. He only wanted to act like, can I help you? What's going on in your life? And it was a fabulous relationship he had with me and all the other coaches, because they all got to know him that way. I don't know if they were all pumping him like I was, you know, but they all got to know them. And I don't know if the athlete, my hockey players never ever came out to me, hey, what about this Fecteau guy, huh? And I never told them about Dick's story, you know. I didn't think it was proper for me to tell them that. So I'm not sure if the other athletes, I'm sure if the other athletes did know, they would have spoken to each other and they would have talked about it. So I don't think it was a big deal on campus that Dick had this background. But it was a big deal to the kids and to the coaches that Dick was the guy he was, the calm, reassuring guy that he was for everybody on campus. And he was pretty cool that way about it. He certainly was a valued co-worker. He was a true gentleman. I remember reading one of my favorite books is a book called Killer Angels. And it's about Gettysburg. It's about Civil War in Gettysburg. Particularly, it's about second day of the war and the Battle of Little Round Top. And the hero of that battle was a guy named Joshua Chamberlain. And Joshua Chamberlain was a colonel in the main regiment in the U.S. Army. After the war, he became very famous in other battles as well, but after the war, he became president of Bowdoin and governor of Maine. I don't know in which order. I should know that, but I don't. But he was a colonel at the time and the big hero of the Battle of the Round Top. And his commanding officer, after the battle, was asked, tell us what you know about Colonel Chamberlain. And the general said, well, the only way I can describe Colonel Chamberlain is that he's a true gentleman. And a true gentleman is a person who has no vices, but he allows his friends to have vices. And Dick Fecteau allowed his friends to have vices, including me. And he was absolutely terrific that way. And he was absolutely a gentleman. You know, anybody who ever met him was always amazed that this guy went through what? This guy did what? And look at his appearance and the way he conducts himself now. It was always amazing to see. And to this day, every once in a while, I'd bring up the subject at a party, at a social event. I got a story to tell you about a friend of mine. And I tell him about 9 years in solitary confinement and 6 straight years in solitary. And people blown away by it. They want, you know, how could that happen? Where is he now? Is he in a nut house somewhere? No, he's fine, living well in Lynn, Massachusetts, the hometown where he grew up. So I can tell you that My years at BU were a lot of fun. I was a student here as a hockey player myself. I was captain of the team my senior year. I was an assistant coach after that for 3 years before I became the head coach. So I've had 3 squares a day in a hideout, as the Marine Corps likes to talk about, from BU for a long, long time. And one of the great things that happened to me here was my association with Dick Fecteau. He is and was, to all of us, a wonderful human being and an unbelievable example of determination and the will to win. Thank you. Now, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. The bar is calling. Thank you very much.
I would just say personally, I joined the CIA more years ago than I care to remember. But when I joined the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1980s as an operations officer, and we went through paramilitary training and the operations course, the experience of Jack Downing and Dick Fecteau was very well known to us as young officers, and they were very inspirational. But thanks to Dr. Dujmovic's comments, now I realize that when we went through the paramilitary course and we had to do a week of escape and evasion, followed by a long weekend of imprisonment, that I have Dick Fecteau to thank for that experience. I also have to thank Nick, because, you know, I always thought that was the reason why Jack Downing got a steeper sentence, was because he was from Yale. So I'm glad, nothing against BU. We rank up there very highly, and I'm really glad you came here to make it clear for us, right? So you could look at the talks that we've had today, and it's really true. I mean, fact is stranger than fiction. I mean, if you wrote this in a book, you would put it in the fiction section of the library, right? It's just absolutely remarkable. You can't make this stuff up. I do want you all to note that this Saturday evening, at a Boston University gala that will be on the penthouse floor of the new Jenga building. The Jenga building is you can't miss it. Just look to your right when you leave Kilachand. The 17-story, I don't know the type of architecture, but it's unique. That Dick Fecteau will be honored by Boston University, and he will receive the Distinguished Alumni Award. And that is the highest honor that Boston University can bestow upon alumni. Several of us worked very hard to help expedite that effort. I'm very glad to say that the alumni officer who made that happen, this was her crowning achievement. As soon as he was going to be given the award, that was the capstone to her career, and she retired. But it was very, very great that she worked this very diligently. So it's appropriate that Mr. Fecteau will be getting this honor. I think, unfortunately, because of his health situation, he's not going to be able to attend in person and get it. But it's an honor that certainly is very, very deserving. So let me also give some shout outs to the organizations and people that made this possible. First, organizationally, I want to thank the Pardee School of Global Studies, specifically the Pardee Center for the Longer Range Future, and its director, our colleague, Jorge Heine, for his support. The Boston University Center for the Study of Asia, under Bob Hefner, for their support. And here, the Kilachand Honors College being able to use this very nice facility, to thank Director Holt for her help. We had a lot of great student support. Stephanie Rizicki, my graduate assistant, was instrumental in helping us, and we had wonderful support from Margot Stanton and the students at Delta Phi Epsilon, which is a student organization focusing on international relations. And Ambassador Mark Storella is the faculty advisor who gave our welcoming remarks. Thank you, Ambassador. Supporters also include Robert Gold and Joseph Burke, question class of '83. Joe is not able to be with us because he is in Texas because his daughter's getting married. And I said, come on, Joe, you got to have a better excuse than that. But Joe Burke and his brother both played football here when Dick Fecteau was the assistant athletic director. And it confirms what you said. Joe Burke's recollection he doesn't remember Fecteau ever talking about his CIA service. He said what he remembers about Dick Fecteau was he always talked about the importance of teamwork and being part of a team. And I think that's kind of interesting just how low-key Dick was about his rather unique and considerable accomplishments. So let me thank you all very much for coming. Again, we will be having a reception at Cornwall's, and that'll start at around 5:15 p.m. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to see you here today. Thank you.